What happens when the professional lines between patient and psychiatrist are indelibly crossed? Cree LeFavour will be here to talk about her new memoir, Lights On, Rats Out.
I was depressed. I realized that the way I had been living my life, I had pretty much always been depressed.
What inspires an author to shift from writing poignant, moving works of fiction to writing a laugh-out-loud comic novel? Andrew Sean Greer will be here to discuss his new book, Less.
I found funny things happening all the time, and they were always my fault because I was the thing out of place with terrible misperceptions about what was supposed to happen.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Joining us now is Cree LeFavour. She is the author of a new memoir, Lights On, Rats Out. Cree, thanks for being here.
Great to be here, Pamela. Thanks.
All right, I want to start with this title because it's not obvious. What does it mean?
It means the moment when I come to grips with the idea that I need to shove my demons out. In other words, turn the lights on, which I've been trying to turn on, and they've been going on and off, to extend the metaphor, throughout the book in many ways as I've tried to struggle and get out from under what's been oppressing me. So lights on, and all those rats being the sort of things that are bothering me or, so anyway, lights on, rats out.
Tormenting you.
Thank you. Yes, tormenting
I would find
me.
rats tormenting. So.
Yes.
Let's go back to before this book, because I think you are probably known most as a writer of food and a writer of cookbooks. And just talk a little bit about your career as a food writer and author of cookbooks, and then how you got to this.
So I grew up in a restaurant family. My father's a chef, and I kind of stumbled into writing cookbooks. I pitched one early on about 10 years ago, which is called The New Steak. And then I sort of went along and wrote these single subject cookbooks. And then I did some ghostwriting and I did some other work. By the time I was on my fourth book and ghostwriting another, I was really done. I didn't feel like writing cookbooks was all that challenging. And I don't mean to say it's not a great form, or I was just really tired of it. And I sort of felt like a little kid at the kids' table at Thanksgiving, and all the other adult writers were up there writing novels and nonfiction and whatever else. So I had a bit of a inferiority crisis, let's put it that way. And I'd always wanted to really write, and I didn't feel like I was doing that with cookbooks.
Had you wanted to write this memoir for a long time, or did you just know that you wanted to do something different and weren't quite sure what it would be?
I wish it were that sort of planned or calculated. In fact, I found myself in something of a crisis right around 2012, and I needed to write my way out of it. So I hadn't thought about writing this book at all. And if I had thought about writing a book, I imagined it more as a memoir about food. So when I sat down to write this, I wrote it somewhat in a sort of white heat. There's a note on the text in here, and I have my psychiatric file from my 3 years of treatment with the doctor in the book. And I also have my notes from the psychiatric hospital where I was treated for 2 months. So I went back to those, which was really challenging because they were really kind of radioactive to me. I had moved on. I had kids. I got married. I went to grad school. I wrote cookbooks. I raised a family. And I found myself in a situation where I felt like I needed to figure out what I'd lost. And I was very depressed, and I had no shrink. And I just went back to that file as a way to sort of recover something. Well,
now our listeners are all dying to know what happened and what was going on. So tell us about what period the memoir covers and what was going on with you at that time.
It begins when I was 24. I was living in Burlington, Vermont. I found myself very depressed, bulimic, and I stumbled into going to a psychiatrist through my boyfriend, actually, at the time, because I don't think I would have had the audacity to actually do that. I come from a background where you don't go to a shrink. That's just not what you do. You're a WASP, you stiff upper lip. It's exotic and otherworldly. But I was really curious, and I think that the minute I stepped in the door, I was smitten with the process, with this man, with everything about it. So I spent 3 years in therapy, and proceeded to get extremely entangled with my psychiatrist. And so during that time, I began burning my arm with cigarettes, and I ended up in a psychiatric hospital, Shepherd Pratt, in Baltimore for 2 months as well.
So you started burning yourself after you went into therapy?
Yes.
And was it the bulimia, and were there other factors that led you to enter in the first place?
I was depressed. I realized that the way I had been living my life, I had pretty much always been depressed. But when you feel like that, you don't really know that that's not how everyone feels. Or you just think, that's how I am.
Right.
That's how I view the world. I was incredibly agoraphobic. I did have boyfriends occasionally, 2 of them, but, they were always really damaged, sort of potheads or alcoholics, not real relationships.
Right.
So that was probably more of what was going on. I would say the bulimia, which I think eating disorders, well, I don't want to generalize, actually. I'll just say for myself that it was a bit of a sideshow. I mean, it is doing violence to oneself much in the same way burning yourself with cigarettes is or cutting yourself. But I don't actually separate them quite as much as maybe they are commonly separated.
And was it the experience of therapy that led you to make that connection for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the funny thing about this book is, of course, when you're writing about 25 years prior, you're kind of writing, obviously, from your current perspective.
Right.
So I have learned a lot about the then by writing this book. It's a tricky narrative, sleight of hand, to have a first-person present tense narrative, which is what my book is. And yet, of course, I'm writing it 25 years later.
Did you try to enter into that voice and kind of strip out those layers of later understanding and insight?
I do. And I try to, I think fortunately, because I had those voluminous notes to work from and quote from, it kept me in that moment. It kept me honest to what was actually going on then. Because memory, of course, is famously unreliable. And I think had I not had those notes, I would have written a very different book. This book is very much grounded in the reality of what was going on then because of that. And I can't say that my current perspective isn't in the book, because of course it is. There's no way to avoid that.
Yeah.
But I think when you read the book, you find there's an internal voice, there's the dialogue. Not that they're separate, they're all of a piece. But I think some of the reflection probably, I'm not sure at the time I would have had quite the ability to articulate those insights the way I can now. In other words, I can see it now more clearly.
A lot of this had to do with the therapist that you ended up seeing, the psychiatrist, Adam Cole. Who was he? How did you find him? It's, a lot of people don't find that person right away. They might go from one psychiatrist to another before they find that person.
Absolutely. I feel like I lucked into a brilliant man. I found him immediately warm, intelligent. I mean, he's very trained. I'm kind of a snob for psychiatrists as opposed to other types of therapists, and I'm sure that's entirely unfair. But I like the level of training that he had, and he was practicing in Burlington, Vermont. I actually happened to go with my boyfriend at the time because he was seeing him weekly. And so he wanted me to come along and explain his problems to the shrink, which was kind of hilarious because clearly I was complaining about them all the time. So
that's a great way to fall into therapy.
It is. It worked.
It's a great story.
It worked. So, and then from there, I very much got attached, and I very much found therapy to be kind of an exclusive world that I could occupy in my head. And if you're lonely and you're living by yourself and you're kind of not happy with your own mental state, and you enter into this relationship where you can actually engage with someone who sees you in a way that's much kinder, much fuller than you perceive yourself, it can be a little addictive. Or at least it was for me.
You fell in love with him.
I did. I think at the time I might have skirted that, but I also kind of knew it. It was very hard for me to admit that at the time because it felt so forbidden. And there was no transgression whatsoever. Thank God he was incredibly ethical and maintained every boundary that one should maintain. I mean, for the most part. I mean, there was no, in other words, there was nothing sexual about the relationship in any other way than in my mind, at least. Transference and countertransference are tricky business. All kinds of things go on in that room that are well beyond our immediate knowledge, so it's a complicated process.
Did you confess it to yourself and ever to him?
As I write in the book, I did it in sort of sideways manner. I would say, I want you to take me home with you. And
not so sideways.
Yeah, not so sideways, except that I think I meant it also in the context a little bit like I also wanted to be his daughter.
Yeah.
Which is what's confusing about it. I was in love with him, but I was also sort of in love with the idea of just belonging to him. Like
being taken care of.
Yeah, being taken care of. So it gets really complicated with sort of paternal feelings along with sexual ones. And that's kind of what happens, I think, in life. I mean, our sexual feelings get really entangled in all kinds of relationships. And maybe we don't think about it as much or talk about it as much as one might in therapy. I mean, we talked about it now and again, but I was definitely shy of it. And I had some sexual dreams about him that I would confess. And that was probably the furthest I ever went.
And you mentioned earlier that you had these notes. Was it from these sessions or was it from when you were hospitalized? And how did you get them?
So it is really quite unusual to have your file, as probably most people know who have ever been in treatment. When I left, he offered them to me. He said, "Do you want a copy of your file?" And I said, I don't know. Sure. I felt a little like, "Oh, are you sure you have time to copy it?" And he had his receptionist copy it while we were in session. So I took it, but I didn't look at it. I put it away. And I knew it was there. And I kept contact actually with him over the years, not in the last 10 years, but, after I left treatment. The notes from the psychiatric hospital I requested when I began writing the book.
Why did he offer you the file?
I don't know. I think what he said to me at the time was, "You might want this someday." And to me, that feels now like a gift. Like he knew maybe that at some point I would need to go back and look at this period in my life. He always said to me, "What are you going to say to your children about the scars on your arm? What are you going to tell them?" At the time that seemed very far away, very remote, and I never was shy about my scars, and I still am not. I just never wanted to hide them or pretend I didn't say what they were over the years because people are too polite to ask you what your scars are.
Except for kids.
Kids do. That's exactly right. And it can be really uncomfortable because they'll walk right up to you and say, what's that? What's that? My standard line was, "It's a long story." My kids, as they got older, started asking in a more serious way. Like they wanted answers. And I said, "Listen, I'll tell you about it when I'm ready." My son in particular pressed me. He let up finally.
Did you think about this book in a way as a way of telling them?
I wonder. It's funny because I don't think I did. And I think that actually it did force me to tell them because by the time the book had a publisher, I said, "Okay, I've written this book. It's going to be published, and this is what it's about, and this is what happened." They didn't know I'd spent time in a psychiatric hospital. They didn't really know anything about this period. So that was hard. But maybe you'll have to ask me that in 10 years. I think the answer is no, but maybe I did. I don't know.
So with these papers, the file that he gave you, this is a kind of technical question, but are they yours or are they his? And did you have to go back and ask him permission to then quote from them in the book?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's a really naughty kind of legal question. I think that since he gave them to me, that they are mine. I don't think a patient has the right to request their file. I think it belongs to the psychiatrist. Some legal mind can tell me I'm incorrect, I'm sure, but that is my understanding. So the fact that he gave them to me, I don't think put me in a position of needing to ask his permission. He is actually not living in any case.
There goes the next question.
That may simplify the matter, yeah.
Did you decide to write this after he had died, knowing that, okay, now I can write this book?
I didn't. I actually wrote it because I was too afraid to get in touch with him because I was afraid he might be dead. So I wrote the book as a way to kind of get back in contact with him without actually doing so. Because at the time, I think I felt like if I were to find out that he was in fact dead, I wouldn't be able to handle it. It just felt like too much.
So how did you find out that he was dead?
Well, I had written much of the book, and I was still in a fairly large crisis. And in fact, as you said earlier, most people go to many psychiatrists or therapists or whatever before they find one that fits. So I was in New Jersey trying to find someone.
Mm-hmm.
I went to 3 different people, and they were hopeless. So at that point, when I had sort of done 3, I got the courage up to call his colleague, actually. And she very wisely didn't answer my question whether he was alive or not. I think she's probably very practiced because I think she could hear that it was of great import to me. And she instead referred me to a colleague of hers in New York to go talk to her and then contend with that issue. And that's exactly what I did. She referred me to a great psychiatrist in New York who I've been seeing for the last 4 years, and she has been amazing.
So how did you find out that he was dead, and what did you feel when you found that out?
I finally called his wife,
Mm-hmm.
and she very, very quickly just said, he's dead. And that was it. And it was a shock to me. I think on some level, I knew that. I think I knew that. He had been ill, actually, the last time I spoke to him, and that had been 10 years ago. So,
Would you have wanted him to read it, this book? Or is it a relief, kind of him never having read it?
I think I would have. And it's funny because I began by writing this book as kind of it was kind of a love letter to him.
Mm-hmm.
It was a way of saying thank you. It was a way of explaining what I felt and telling him this is how I saw it, like almost just sort of like a tribute. So I think I would have wanted him to read it. But one of my great fears was that, and in fact, it's played out to some extent as some people have read the book, they have blamed him for some of what went on. And there was some of my self-destruction and various choices he made. And I don't blame him at all. It's not meant to be that, but many readers may find that. It's actually open to interpretation.
Before we end, would you mind reading a passage?
Oh, not at all. So this is chapter 1. Just the title is Kid Gloves. First degree, a superficial burn of the epidermis. Grazing the bare forearm against a hot baking sheet loaded with sugar cookies might cause such a minor infliction. Firsts heal in days and leave no scar. Baby stuff. At the other extreme, the most severe 4th degree extends through the epidermis and dermis, damaging the subcutaneous tissue, including muscle and bone. House on fire and no way out bad. This meanie requires excision, a word as hideous as the procedure, cutting away and removing dead flesh and damaged bone, only to repair the gap with grafts of healthy skin harvested from elsewhere on the body.
All right, then. That's from Lights On, Rats Out by Cree LeFavour. Cree, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Pamela. It's great.
Andrew Sean Greer joins us now. His new novel is called Less, and it is on the cover of the New York Times Book Review this week. Andy, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, this is a book about a failed novelist. You are not a failed novelist. What drew you to this foreign creature?
I think it's not hard for any novelist to consider themselves failed at any point. Even the greatest writers I know, they feel like they're on the outside because I think you're alone all the time, so you're sure you've just lost it every day.
And a failed novelist is sort of not a foreign creature in the world of letters. Like, what's the draw of that kind of character?
Because it's such an enormous amount of vanity to be a novelist, it's easy to pierce it at any moment, and comically, I think. Because the whole thing is something you're making, and no one wants to read it. You're certain of it. So at many times, it's just feels tragic, but actually it's kind of funny when you look back.
And this is your 6th book.
This is my 6th book.
Did you consider this to be a kind of break from what you were doing earlier, or is it sort of on a natural continuum with your previous novels?
I think it's a break. I think if I were classier, I'd say, like, you don't see the line going through. But for me, I actually started off writing one of my normal, poignant, wistful novels, and I just thought, I just can't do it anymore. I just don't feel like it.
You don't feel poignant anymore?
I think I was too depressed to write something sad.
When did you start writing?
This book?
Yeah.
Probably 3 years ago. 3 years ago.
Why were you depressed?
Oh, I just, why was I depressed? I think I wasn't happy with my last book, with how it was received. Vanity, again, because actually it did really great. But in my mind, people weren't showing up to readings. And so I got really down and I thought, I'm going to write a book about a sad writer. And like, no one can really feel sorry for that dude. Like a middle-aged white guy who can't write his book is not a sad story. So instead, I turned it around and it was much more fun to write that way.
This is a real comic novel.
Yeah, I hope so.
Tell us what it's about.
It's about this failed writer on the cusp of turning 50. His old lover has left him and is marrying someone else. And to escape the wedding, which would be humiliating, and to escape not going to the wedding, which would be obvious to people, he accepts every invitation he finds in his mail, which is to a series of bizarre conferences and teaching gigs and travel posts that leads him on a trip around the world.
So where does Arthur Less go?
He starts in New York, which to me is traveling, but not to a New Yorker, Mexico City, France, Italy, Berlin, Morocco, India, Japan, and home to San Francisco.
And did you go to all these places, or had you been to all these places to kind of research the novel?
To try to make money, I was turning into a travel writer, but I
thought you were going to say you were going to all these conferences too.
I wasn't going to the conferences. I was going on much less exotic trips, although the places were exotic. And because I was alone, I would just take notes on every detail I saw. And so my rule for myself for this book was that I couldn't put in any detail I hadn't written in my notes, that I hadn't actually seen, because I didn't want a fantasy of a foreign place. I wanted the things I actually saw.
Well, you are familiar with foreign places because you live half in San Francisco and half in Tuscany.
That's right. Yeah, I do.
That sounds like perfect, is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's strange to move your life. I'm a director of a writer's residency outside of Tuscany. And so I lead this sort of other life with pugs and writers and a lot of red wine.
That sounds torturous.
Yeah, it's a really hard life. No one suffers the way I do.
The book is about Americans abroad and sort of expatriate life, too. So I'm sure your own experience informed that to some degree.
Well, I found funny things happening all the time, and they were always my fault because I was the thing out of place with terrible misperceptions about what was supposed to happen, how toilets flushed or how subways worked or almost anything. So I kept making mistakes and everyone was very kind to me. So I put them down and gave all of the details to Arthur, although all of the characters are inventions and situations.
All right, well, tell us some of those funny stories, yours, and then how they sort of changed when they became Arthur's.
One that doesn't seem particularly funny is the trouble getting the VAT system. You know, when you buy something in Europe,
oh my God,
you get your tax back if you can figure it out.
It's so hard.
Have you ever done that?
I have actually done it. I've done it, but I was successful on about like 30% of the receipts. And so, felt mournful about the 70% that I just didn't quite get right.
I mean, you have to like wear the items to the customs department and show them that it's this bizarre process. You have to kind of have them and prove you bought them. You have to find the customs office. That you have to stamp it.
It's hidden.
It's hidden. Once they do it, they don't take it. You have to mail it. You have to put it in a special box. I've done the whole thing right and then put it in a trash can by mistake that I thought was a mailbox in France. You have to stamp it at the place you're leaving Europe, which once for me was Greece. And the whole thing was closed, and there was a sort of Sybil in a cage I had to get to her to get her to look it through and stamp it. But I did once, the last time, managed to get the whole thing back.
Wow. It's one of those processes that I feel like everyone who's involved with it seems to know what they're doing, but in fact often doesn't. So the people in the stores who are selling it, I don't know, my experience is often in France, where they'll sort of like, some of them have special envelopes that each have a kind of different way of doing it. And the truth is, I think that none of them understand it either.
Yeah, they're all sure that it's going to work out fine because they only do that particular portion. I once had everything right, but the envelope I got was stamped Ireland. And so they wouldn't accept it because the things I bought were in Italy, and I kind of lost my cool.
Can you write an entire novel about this, please?
It's in here. I put it into the book. He has trouble.
How does it?
Well, I just wanted him to lose his mind And so he lost his mind. He bought some ridiculous item in Italy with some prize money he gets. And then he tries to go through the whole system and fails. And he's at the end of his rope. And then the flight he's taking, which is to Marrakesh, announces that it's willing to give 600 euros to anyone who will take the flight later that night. And he's like, I'm your man. Feels like that's the salvation. He gets 600 euros back that he couldn't get with the VAT. And then suddenly he spends the day in Paris.
So we can say that the book is about a failed novelist. We can say that it's also a satire of Americans abroad. What's it really about to you?
Well, it's just going to sound so sappy. It's really about love and figuring out what that really is, not just like strangers who say they love you, like who love writers in some way, and the way it changes over time, an old love relationship and a new one, and whether love is the good dear thing you have with a spouse over years and, you know, they don't mind if you make a mess in the kitchen, or whether it's some lightning strike that's supposed to happen and you drop everything and run off.
So this is sounding now like one of your earlier poignant moving novels, yet you did it through comedy.
There is a through line, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it to me, it's the same concerns about love and the passage of time.
How different was it to do that in a comic novel?
Weirdly, it's the same thing. You put your character in a situation that upends their expectations, and in a serious novel, it leads to self-doubt and introspection. And in a comic novel, it leads to pratfall. You know, the very same story. I don't know if the VAT would be a touching story in a serious novel. But, you know, at one point he takes a sleeping pill just before he's landing in Frankfurt and has to make his way through the airport and gets into the wrong car waiting for him, which I guess that could lead to tragedy in a thriller or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But this one, of course, is just humiliation as he goes to the wrong
So
hotel.
we here at the Book Review know that you can write with comic flair because you review for us, and I've reviewed funny books and have just written reviews that have that element to it. But why did you not write a comic novel earlier, do you think?
That's a good question. People ask me that because when I when I do my readings, I guess I'm kind of funnier than anyone is expecting me to be.
They're expecting you to be poignant and moving?
Yeah, but how could you be that on stage all the time? That would be a drag. I think I took myself a little too seriously before. Not that I'm not proud of all of those books. And I think I finally decided not to. I think that's middle age, where you just think, we're not improving this person you are, so all we can do is laugh at the problems. And maybe I reached that.
Do you think you're going to continue in this vein?
I would love to. It was a blast. Yeah.
Was it harder in any way to write a comic novel than to work in that earlier mode?
No, because you could get away with bad sentences and things because they were meant to be clunky because it was funnier that way. It was much more freeing. I feel like people wouldn't, because when you write something really serious, if you go too far into sentiment, people reject it. But in a comic novel, you're kind of hoping you're going to get to sentiment in some way because you have to reward this poor character who's being tortured.
But tortured for a good cause.
A good cause, literature.
Well, literature, yes. And it's being published in summer. Did you think of this as a kind of more of an entertainment in a way when you were working on it?
I like the way Graham Greene would talk about, he would alternate between his serious novels and his entertainments. Now it's hard to see the difference sometimes in those books of his. And I prefer his entertainments, honestly. So yeah, I guess I thought of it that way. It's only published in summer because I'd left Tuscany 3 days ago, and they planned the pub date for when I could finally make it to the States.
You wanted to be in New York during the sweatiest, muggiest time of the year.
I get to wear new clothes.
Well, there's a lot to persuade people to read the novel. It is, as I mentioned, on the cover of the book review. The blurb from Gary Steingart on the front of the book says, marvelously, unexpectedly, endearingly funny. And Nell Zink says you will sob little tears of joy. But if I had to ask you, and there's many, many more exciting and fun blurbs on the back, but if I had to ask you to kind of sell someone on picking up this book right now and reading it, what would you say to them?
I would say that you're really going to enjoy yourself, and then you're going to bawl at the end.
Well, that's the best thing you can do with the book,
Well, that's
isn't
what
it?
I like from a book.
Andy, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
The book, again, is called Less by Andrew Sean Greer, and it is reviewed this week on our cover. Alexandra Alter joins us now with notes from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So we have a fun story this week.
Yes, this week I did a story about this new novel, Minecraft the Island. And for Minecraft players, it'll be very obvious sort of where this is going. But I had never been aware of this whole body of literature, of almost fan fiction that exists that's based on video games.
Yeah, it's like an industry.
It's an
itself.
incredibly lucrative niche in the publishing industry. And as I started to look into this story, I found novels based on World of Warcraft and Halo and Doom. And it was
Plants vs. Zombies.
Oh, of course.
Some graphic novels. I
And
happen
these
to have
books-
some in-house fans,
Oh,
so
good.
I feel
You
like I
probably know more
know.
than I do. These books have sold millions of copies, and it's just fascinating to me when another medium, when you have these kind of tie-in books and you see that the fan base is so fervent that they will not only spend hours playing the game, they will then spend their reading time reading about the game.
Well, it's like world building in different formats, right?
Exactly. I think there is a big overlap between readers and gamers, actually, as we're seeing with some of the sales figures for some of these books. So Minecraft was interesting for a number of reasons. It's the first officially sanctioned Minecraft novel. There's plenty of fan fiction that you can find on Amazon. But this is the first time that the company, Mojang, which is a Swedish company and Microsoft owns the company now. It's the first time that they said, we're going to put our stamp on a novel and sort of, be a little bit in control of the property. And they wanted to do that, I think, because I think maybe they saw the success of some of the fan fiction. They have an incredibly popular line of manuals that have sold millions of copies around the world.
Yeah,
So
some very elaborate books,
very
too,
elaborate.
the nonfiction
yes,
side.
Yes, and they're working on a feature film with Warner Brothers. So they're sort of kind of tapping into the brand power and seeing how far they can extend it. So a novel was the next step. And the other thing that interested me about it was the author that they found, Max Brooks. He is the author of World War Z, which was a huge bestseller.
And a movie.
And a movie that, of course, with Brad Pitt. We have to mention Brad Pitt if possible on the podcast. So he was an interesting figure, I think, to find to write this novel because you don't usually see best-selling authors who are known for their own work writing tie-in novels. I think in the literary world, that's kind of a tier that's, you don't control the intellectual property. It's seen as, maybe kind of almost a brand extension or a form of fan fiction as opposed to literature. But he was an enthusiastic Minecraft player. And when the company approached him about doing a novel, he was so excited he wrote an entire draft before he even signed the contract.
Since you've already brought up Brad Pitt, we can mention a couple of other big Hollywood names here in relation to Mr. Brooks, because he is not just any old Max Brooks.
He's no any old Max Brooks. He's the son of Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft. And it was interesting. He actually brought up, sometimes the offspring of celebrity are a little shy about that fact, but he said that his upbringing really shaped this novel because the novel is set on an island. It's a kind of Robinson Crusoe-esque survival story, and it's very much inspired by the game. In fact, he was very careful when he was writing it to make sure that all the plot points can actually be played in the game so that readers can then create the island that he created and create all the booby traps that he created and create kind of the bunker that he created and find the same food that he did. And you can actually play out this novel as a game. But he said that kind of related to his childhood because he was a very sheltered and lonely kid, as the children of celebrities often are. And so he talked to himself all the time. He played with his Star Wars action figures. And that's kind of what this character is faced with all alone on an island.
Celebrity kids, they're just like us.
Exactly. And the other thing I talked to him about writing a book that was kind of commissioned by a brand, because that can be an awkward thing if you're a creative person. Mm-hmm. He said that he didn't have any constraints on the plot, except that the company was very insistent that the main character not be identifiably male or female. They wanted anyone to be able to pick up the book and kind of picture themselves as the character. And
How Swedish.
He is very Swedish. And they even went so far as to commission 2 different versions of the audiobook with a male and female narrator. The male is Jack Black, the actor, and the female is Samira Wiley, so that you can choose the gender of the narrator. And I think that's kind of part of the beauty of the game and why it appeals to people, is that you can build your own world. And so it'll be interesting to see how many Minecraft players come to this novel. There's about 55 million active monthly users, so if a lot of them hear about it, it's potentially a massive hit. But, some of them might prefer to spend their time playing the game.
I have to ask the obvious question. Is there going to be a sequel?
This is a series of novels that the company is planning. I don't know that Max Brooks will be writing another one. I think they're hoping to find a bunch of different writers, all hopefully Minecraft players like he is, to create their own version.
All right. To be continued.
Yes.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Joining us now, my colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and Jennifer Salai to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela. Hi, Pamela.
All right, John, you brought in 2 books, so let's start with you.
I brought in 2 books. One I'm reading and one I just want to read something from.
One you just want to pretend you're reading.
Yes.
He brought in 2 books so you would go to him first.
The thing I'm actually reading, this is one way I read, is that I got a galley, as we do here at the book review, of an upcoming book in October, which is Edward St. Aubyn's new novel called Dunbar.
Yes.
That was very exciting to me because Edward St. Aubyn, I think, is on a very short list of the best prose writers alive right now. So I'm excited about that. But what the book is it's part of this, the publisher Hogarth has a series called the Shakespeare series in which contemporary novelists reimagine Shakespeare's plays as contemporary novels. And so Ann Tyler has done it. I think Joe Nesbo, the thriller writer, is doing Macbeth. And
Margaret Atwood did one.
Margaret Atwood did one, Jeanette Winterson. So it's a very illustrious list of people. And St. Aubyn's is a reimagining of King Lear. I mean, I've read very little Shakespeare. I read Hamlet in high school and college, and I think I read one other in college. But I'd never read King Lear, and so I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, and there's not much to say. It's King Lear. The funny thing is that I know what King Lear is, and with someone as giant as Shakespeare, you have this funny experience where I'm sure that what I thought of King Lear 2 years ago that I could talk about fairly fluently at like a cocktail party is what I'll think about it 10 years from now when I don't really have the memory of reading the play anymore. So it's kind of fascinating to now live in the actual line-by-line world of the play for the only time I probably will. The other thing I brought in, because I'm not reading it cover to cover again, it's one of my favorite novels, Martin Amis's Money. For the past few weeks, I've been mentioning Patricia Lockwood's Priest Daddy, which made me laugh out loud so often that it just made me think about the very few other books that have done that consistently. Sam Lipsyte's Homeland came to mind, and a couple of others. But
I'm seeing a story here, John.
A story about,
that have made you laugh out loud.
This is such a great paragraph, though. I mean, it is funny, but it's more I just love the style of this paragraph and the anthropomorphizing of these birds, as you'll see. But so this is a paragraph of Money by Martin Amis. He's looking at these bees on someone's terrace, and they're flying around, and he says, "I welcomed their company. They wouldn't waste their suicide stings on me. Below lay the checkered decks of half-paved back gardens, fish ponds and weak fountains, curly-cued furniture, an overalled woman with ticking scissors. The birds of New York shivered and croaked among the bent branches. The birds of New York have more or less given up the ghost, and who can blame them? They've been processed by Manhattan in the 20th century. A standard-issue British pigeon would look like a cockatoo among them. A robin redbreast would look like a bird of paradise. The birds of New York are old spivs and dirty macks. They live off charity and welfare handouts. They cough and grumble and flap their arms for warmth. Declassed, they have slipped several links in the chain of being. It's been rough, all right. No more songs or plump worms or flights to summer seas. The 20th has been a bad century for the birds of New York, and they know it." What are you reading?
Well, also speaking of prose stylists, you may remember that for a little while there, I was reading Robert Caro's biography of Robert Moses.
It was only like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, exactly. The Power Broker. While I was reading The Power Broker, our colleague Jenny Schussler, she wanted to know why I was reading, and I explained that I had been going on kind of long walks around the city, getting to know different neighborhoods, and just kind of exploring the city after having worked here for 12 years or more without ever leaving the neighborhood of the New York Times. So I was checking out the waterfront. And as I was doing all that, I was getting curious about the architecture and the urban development. And so that's what led me to Robert Caro. And she said, "Oh, if you enjoy walking the city, you should read A Walker in the City by Alfred Kazin." And it is his memoir. Kazin, of course, is one of the top New York intellectuals from the 1950s. He was part of that whole New York school.
This is such a Jenny Schussler recommendation.
Yeah, it really is.
It is such a Jenny Schussler recommendation.
She's here in spirit.
Alfred Kazin grew up in Brooklyn and in Brownsville, Brooklyn. So part of kind of the Jewish slums there.
Right, the not hipster Brooklyn.
and in the 20s and 30s. And so it was really not hipster Brooklyn. It was the tenements. It was kind of pickle vendors on the corners. Well, that is maybe hipster. Again.
It was a time when Manhattan seemed 1,000 miles away.
Yeah, well, he opens talking about that, kind of moving from Brownsville to the city and what a drastic move that felt. So A Walker in the City is his memoir. It was published in 1951. I picked it up not knowing much about him, except as kind of a critic and intellectual, but he was an amazing writer. The prose in this book is so good. It puts me in mind of like Frank Conroy's Stop Time, or a little bit because he's writing about kind of the immigrant life and the tenement life. Also, a writer like Sandra Cisneros, her book A House of My Own was a memoir, but she's famous for the very autobiographical fiction, The House on Mango Street. This has that same kind of feel of writing about the lower classes, and then it becomes an intellectual memoir, a memoir of how he left the tenements and started exploring the life of the mind instead. And it's just gorgeously written. I'm very grateful to Jenny.
The problem with this segment is that I'm going to end up just always reading behind everybody the same things, and I'm going to come in and talk about them. And then we're not going to have enough variety.
Now you're going to read the...
Well, I want to read that now.
I've got Priest Daddy sitting on my...
You know what, John? It's okay because I'm reading what you were reading last
You want to
week.
go next?
I'll go next. I am reading Lives Other Than My Own by Emmanuel Carrere. And once it was described to me, as I mentioned, I think on last week's podcast, our colleague Barry Guin gave it to me to read about 2.5 years ago. It sat on the back of my desk for the next 2 years. And finally, shamefacedly, I returned it and clearly piqued. He then sent it to Jen Salai, who, being a better colleague than me, read it right away.
No, it was on my desk for about 2 months.
That's nothing compared.
It is so funny to me that we keep talking about Emmanuel Carrere and Barry is not here to talk about him.
Right. Barry is he comes on here occasionally, but he is our nonfiction, very serious nonfiction editor. He does not ever handle fiction. But this is a nonfiction book by Carrere. And I think, John, you talked about it last week. So
yeah, and Jen the week before.
Right. So the pressure was on.
I guess I'm up.
Yes. I'm not on. I've only just begun it. I have nothing original to say that John and Jen haven't already said.
The beginning is pretty stunning, though, isn't it?
The beginning is stunning, and I'm a total sucker for the tsunami. I'm one of those people who has a lifelong fascination with tsunamis. Oh yeah,
even before.
All my childhood dreams were about tsunamis. I know that I'm sure that someone is listening and they're like, very interesting, and they have one of those Freudian dream.
They're like, we accept your insurance.
Books.
Come in and talk about it.
Right.
I don't think I knew what tsunamis were when I was a little kid.
Really?
Yeah.
Tidal waves.
Well, I know now.
I know, but you weren't obsessed with tidal waves?
No.
I thought everyone was, Jen.
No.
Were you not?
A lot of blank stares around the table.
I feel like I always thought that was like a universal
I
childhood.
was obsessed with whales and dinosaurs.
I was not obsessed with tidal waves, no.
You did have an interest, though. No?
You knew what they were.
All right.
I knew what they were.
Not to digress too much, but it does start with the tidal wave of, was it 2004?
Yeah, it's amazing that it was that long ago.
Yeah, and he was there, Emmanuel Carrere, but was not a direct victim. No one in his family was injured, and thus the title Lives Other Than My Own, because, of course, he was in the presence of many people who did lose a loved one. And so I'm still in that, and it's heart-stoppingly good.
And it goes in a totally different direction. I mean, it's still sort of a piece with the beginning of the book, but I was just so surprised by where it went after that. So I'll have to
talk about that next week.
Yeah.
Jen, what are you reading?
So I'm reading this collection of fiction by this Argentine writer, Silvina Ocampo. And she was a name that came up. I had reviewed a few books of Argentine fiction several months ago, all by these youngish Argentine women writers. And one of them had actually written a book about Silvina Ocampo, who's really held in very high esteem in Argentina. She died in the 90s, I think, and she herself was already 90. And she was a contemporary of Borges. He, in fact, actually wrote an introduction to one of her books, which is included in this edition. that New York Review Books Classics published a couple years ago. And so I saw this on the shelf a few weeks ago, and I thought, here's a writer that I've heard so much about. I'd like to read more of her stuff. And sure enough, in terms of the writer who wrote a book about her, Mariana Enriquez, they do share a lot of affinities. And, you know, these stories are really sort of like horror stories in a way, ghost stories, very spooky, although they're all sort of rooted in a certain kind of realism.
What's the book called?
This collection is called Thus Were Their Faces, which I think is the title of one of the stories, which I haven't gotten to. But it really sort of takes pieces from her various books. And she herself was trained as a painter, in fact. And then it was only, I think she was already in her 30s, that she decided that she wanted to write. So she wrote poetry, she wrote stories. She was married to Alfonso Boy Casares, who's also another famous Argentine writer, and her sister, her older sister, started a literary magazine, Sur, in Argentina, which was known for publishing modernists like Casares and Borges. And so she really circulated in those circles. And these stories are just sort of astonishing. You know, a lot of them are written from the perspective of children, which I find really interesting because there's a way in which when you have that narrator or that perspective, you can really see how the world that we actually live in is just so bizarre. And so the first story is only, I think it's like 2 or 3 pages, and it's about a girl who thinks that babies are born. They're not even born. You get them from a shop, and they're wrapped. They're in a box, and you pick them off the shelf, and you bring them home because that's what somebody has told her.
That is absolutely how I got my children.
And so she talks about, you know, this is from the perspective of the child, although it's written from the third person. And so there's one line here where it says, and she's talking about the babies, they arrived quite hot from the trip because they couldn't breathe very well inside the box. And that was why they were so red and cried incessantly, their toes curled up. And so it's only later where another girl tells her, no, in fact, babies grow inside their mother's stomachs and then they come out through the belly button. And of course that opens up like a whole other vista of something weird and strange. And in this introduction that they have from Borges, this is how he describes her work. He says, in Silvina Ocampo's stories, there is something I have never understood, her strange taste for a certain kind of innocent and oblique cruelty. I attribute this to the interest, the astonished interest, that evil inspires in a noble soul. So, I mean, there's something, and there's a lot of sort of heaviness in their story, in the stories, but not in a way that feels oppressive, if that makes sense. I mean, there's just something very...
It's playful and fable-ish, too.
Yeah.
It also has an introduction by Helen Oyeyemi.
Yes.
Which might contextualize it a little.
Yes.
If people like her work.
If people like her work,
this.
yes. She's also a fan. So I highly recommend this so far.
All right. Jen, Greg, John, thanks so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.